There is no pathway to a Palestinian homeland now. You think Hezbollah is defeated? Have you not heard what Hezbollah has said? Netanyahu would have to concede and yield to international pressure to begin serious discussions about the formation of a Palestinian state. No, I reject 100% at this point in time that it's possible to be a Syrian nationalist who was opposed to Bashar al-Assad. Because I just proved to you that doesn't exist anymore. And Russia's in a much stronger negotiating position to impose its its will on the West. So I think the collapse of Europe is strengthening Russia's hand.
Isn't there a possibility, isn't there a fear that NATO ends up getting more strengthened?
To rebuild NATO, you have to tear everything down and start from scratch, and you can't afford that.
Who you are in terms of your philosophies. Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, please smash that subscribe button and also consider being a Patreon or join our membership to have early access in either event. Like our show, share and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome to India and Global Left.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Same to you. I want to start with Palestine, given the news that we are hearing are so depressing. I recently interviewed Norman Finkelstein, and he said Gaza is no more. I wanted to have your response on that, and what do you think is going on in Gaza?
Well, unfortunately, I think Norman is probably closer to the truth than those who believe that the struggle in Gaza is one that can finish with a Palestinian state being formed. Gaza was always going to be the sacrificial lamb in this. It was set up to be such on October 7th. The entire premise behind Sinwar's gambit, October 7th gambit, was to initiate a struggle that would expose the reality of Israel to the world, and in doing so, make the world understand the absolute need for a Palestinian state for the Palestinian people, these people who were children of the camps, people who were literally prisoners in an open air concentration camp. The world seemed to be blind to that reality for so many years, and Sinwar's actions basically opened the door for Israel to prove to the world what Sinwar and the other Palestinians knew, that it is a genocidal state that believes in racial supremacy based upon one's religious identity. If you're Jewish, you are a superhuman, God's chosen, and if you're not Jewish, you are a human animal that can be slaughtered at will with no recourse to the law. And it almost worked. I mean, the tragedy is that, there is always going to be horrific death. I've likened it in the past to the sacrifice made by the French on the eve of the Normandy invasion, when Charles de Gaulle was briefed by the Allied commanders what the cost of human lives would be to the French civilian population of the Normandy Peninsula. And indeed, 60,000 died to be liberated, but it was a price that had to be paid. There was no other way around this. And if you want to create a Palestinian state at a time when Israel openly denies the possibility of a Palestinian state, then you must engage in a conflict that defeats Israel existentially. And one of the ways you can defeat them, especially if you can't defeat them in a stand-up military on military fight, is to defeat them as an identity, to get the world to reject Zionist Israel. And the world was well on the path towards making that happen. The International Court of Justice had found that Israel was carrying out acts of genocide. The International Criminal Court had indicted Netanyahu and the defense minister for war crimes. And around the world, nations were turning their back on Israel. including nations that had been, I guess, siding up to Israel, like Saudi Arabia was on the cusp of normalizing relations with Israel. And because of Israel's actions, Saudi Arabia had moved away from that. Israel was unable to defeat Hamas militarily, unable to eliminate Hamas politically. And then, as Israel expanded the conflict, they were similarly unable to defeat Hezbollah militarily or politically. And so Israel was in a bind. The economy was collapsed politically. Netanyahu was isolated. The only way he could stay in power was by creating this far right wing coalition that only helped Hamas because it proved, again, right there, you didn't have to um, try to interpret what the Israelis are saying or read between the lines. This cabinet straight out said, we are seeking the genocide of the Palestinian people. We don't care about them. They're human animals. They must be slaughtered. But then Syria collapsed, and nobody anticipated that. And with the collapse of Syria, so went the viability of the axis of resistance, at least in the short term. Um, and in one fell swoop, Israel went from being a nation facing existential strategic defeat to a nation that was on the rebound. Suddenly, Netanyahu was able to rebrand himself as the man who defeated Iran, the man who defeated Hezbollah, the man who was going to defeat Hamas. And now Hamas is fairly well isolated. Um, I mean, the rapidity in which the Arab world abandoned the cause of Hamas, the cause of the Palestinian people, and celebrated the demise of Bashar al-Assad just goes to once again reinforce the fact that the Palestinian people never mattered to the larger Arab world or to the larger Muslim Ummah family. Um, and this is the reality that must be faced today. I continue to believe that the Palestinian people deserve a homeland, and I support, the struggle for the Palestinian people to get a homeland. But you have to be realistic. And the fact is, right now, there is no pathway to a Palestinian homeland now. Hamas is isolated. Gaza is destroyed, and the population of Gaza have a stark choice: um, flee or die, flee or die, depopulate or die. And the world is not going to do anything to lift a hand to prevent them from dying. So ultimately, I believe that Gaza will be depopulated and Israel will take it over, and it will be a crushing defeat for the Palestinian cause. It's not something I'm happy about. I continue to condemn with the harshest possible terms the Muslim world and the Arab world for celebrating the demise of Bashar al-Assad's regime at the expense of the Palestinians.
It's interesting. You have been among those in the last year or so who've been, mm, if I read you correctly, who haven't been extremely pessimistic until at least fall of Syria, as far as what was going on in Palestine and even South Lebanon. And now what I hear you is that you are relatively more pessimistic. Was it just Syria, or I also wonder something changed in your assessment about what happened in South Lebanon? Because a lot of people thought, drawing from the Second Lebanon War in 2006, that it would be a genuine stalemate at the least. But now a lot of people reads that this time Israel was much more dominant over Hezbollah. What's your assessment on that front?
I just want to remind the people that think that Israel was dominant over Hezbollah to understand that it was the Israelis who pushed for the ceasefire, not Hezbollah. Israel desperately needed the ceasefire because their military was not defeating Hezbollah. Um, yes, Israel enjoyed some strategic successes: the murder of Hassan Nasrallah, the elimination of senior Hezbollah staff, and the infliction of damage on the Hezbollah military infrastructure. All is true. But in the last week before the ceasefire, Israel sent in the Golani Brigade and the 7th Armored Brigade, two of their elite formations, and they were defeated on the battlefield by Hezbollah. I'll just say that one more time to sink it in. They were defeated on the battlefield by Hezbollah. If you think Israel beat Hezbollah, you know nothing about the fighting that was going on in southern Lebanon. But the difference between 2006 and today is that Hezbollah is more than just a resistance movement. Hezbollah is a political party that plays a very important role in the politics of Lebanon. And the Israelis had expanded the scope and scale of their military actions in Lebanon to go beyond simply punishing traditional Hezbollah strongholds, and we're branching out to punish Lebanon as a whole. And the Lebanese government, of which Hezbollah is a part of, an important part of, said that they have to have a ceasefire, that this cannot continue. And Hezbollah, because they are a member of the government, acceded to that, said, yes, we will do this ceasefire. But Hezbollah's premise was always that Israel will not comply with this ceasefire. And that at the end of the 60-day period, Hezbollah will be empowered by the failure of Israel to comply to continue the conflict. Indeed, we see that now. You think Hezbollah is defeated? Have you not heard what Hezbollah has said? At the end of the 60 days, they are going to resume military. Is that the language of a defeated party? Absolutely not. And moreover, Israel has occupied parts of southern Lebanon. And if it doesn't retreat from withdrawal, they will be in violation, open violation of the ceasefire agreement. And we return to the scenario of the 1990s and 2000s, where Israel is an illegitimate occupying power of Lebanon, and Hezbollah becomes the resistance movement that will seek to evict Israel from the illegally occupied territories. This legitimizes Hezbollah in a way that is unimaginable. Now, Hezbollah will succeed in this fight. Israel cannot defeat Hezbollah on the ground in southern Lebanon. It is impossible for Israel to do this. What Lebanon might be more constrained in being able to do is inflict damage on Israel proper. In order to have a strategic strike capacity against a sustainable strategic strike capacity against Israel, Hezbollah needs a sustainable supply line connecting it with Iran. That was done through Syria. And with the collapse of Syria, that umbilical cord has been cut. And so Hezbollah is somewhat constrained in terms of what it will be able to do in terms of the strategic aspects of its resistance. It will resist in southern Lebanon, but its ability to take the fight into Israel in a decisive manner is somewhat constrained. They may have retained some capability, but if they start using that capability, it'll be very difficult to replenish that capability. And so Hezbollah is a diminished power, not a defeated power, but a diminished power. And without Hezbollah able to carry out this war of attrition, sustainable over the long term, it makes it difficult for Hamas. People don't understand how close Israel was to strategic defeat, how close the gambit of Sinwar almost worked. Yes, he was dead. Yes, Hassan Nasrallah was dead. But 2 weeks prior to the or a week prior to the collapse of Israel, let's say mid-November of last year, Netanyahu was facing political catastrophe, because again, he had not defeated Hamas. And he was compelled, because of the successful resistance of Hezbollah, to seek a ceasefire that he didn't want, his right-wing party didn't want. They were compelled by the military because of the weakness of Israel. Not only that, the hostage crisis in Gaza was threatening to bring him down politically. There was a huge scandal. I don't know what happened to it now, but Seymour Hersh wrote about this scandal in his Substack, and it was based on the fact that Netanyahu had lied to the Israeli people about who was to blame for the failure to get the hostages released. He blamed it on Hamas, and he did a briefing where he cited uh, a document, a Hamas document, and he quoted from it to make his case. But as Seymour Hersh points out, that document was so highly classified. Not only were you not permitted to quote from it, you weren't allowed to even acknowledge its existence. This document existed in a secret room in military intelligence headquarters, and and Netanyahu violated the law and bring that out. And the other aspect is he misrepresented this intelligence. He talked about it by quoting a hypothetical scenario that people said Sinwar should consider in this internal Hamas document, which was Sinwar should flee um, Gaza with the hostages and go to Iran. And Netanyahu cited this and said, see, they never intended to release the hostages. But the very next page went on to say Sinwar rejected this, that he will remain in Gaza with the hostages, looking to exchange the hostages for release of prisoners and other things. So Netanyahu lied. Court cases were opened up against him that could have brought him down. So Netanyahu was literally in danger of being kicked out of power before the year ended. And if Netanyahu's government collapsed, Israel's internal political dynamic would be one of chaos and anarchy that could lead to the political defeat of Israel. You combine that with the ongoing economic disaster that's taken place in Israel because of the resistance, the Ansarallah, the Houthi successful blockading of Eilat, the southern port of Eilat, 60 to 80,000 Israelis dislocated from their homes in the north, can't go back. Tens of thousands dislocated around Gaza, can't go back. No foreign investment, no hope. Israel was defeated. And there was every reason to believe that whatever government replaced Netanyahu would have to concede and yield to international pressure to begin serious discussions about the formation of a Palestinian state. This is how close Israel was to being defeated. But the collapse of Syria has allowed Netanyahu's government to uh, redefine, the political reality. They now claim to be victorious. There's still a lot of problems. Don't get me wrong. And Netanyahu's health is a big concern because this is a man who just had prostate surgery, level 3 cancer, stage 3 cancer. He may not be long for this world. And without Netanyahu, this far right wing coalition will not survive. And the collapse of that coalition will lead to the very kind of political struggle that had existed before. But the difference is this political struggle will take place in an environment where Israel believes that it has defeated Hezbollah and defeated Iran. And therefore, it makes the people who supported that policy have some political viability that otherwise wouldn't exist. But I'm pessimistic for Hamas because of the cutting of the umbilical cord. That's it. If Bashar al-Assad was still in power today, I'd be very bullish on the possibility of a Palestinian state. But because of the collapse of this, um, I just think there's a new political dynamic that doesn't bode well for Hamas or the future of a Palestinian state.
Yeah, this is very interesting because what you were saying is you don't think that that the assessment of balance of power between Hezbollah and Israel is significantly skewed in favor of Israel, which some people have recently come to believe. Many I know used to believe that the balance was significant. The balance was somewhat even, but recent news and events have convinced them that it has been skewed in favor of Israel. But that's not what you think. Where your pessimism comes from is from fall of Syria. So
Well, but
yeah,
we need to be careful here.
sure.
What made Hezbollah such a powerful force was that Hezbollah worked in concert with Iran, and that you couldn't separate the two when talking about a war with Israel. give you an example. If Israel were to launch a large-scale military strike against Iran, Hezbollah serves as a loaded pistol in the head of Israel. And so Israel strikes Iran and the loaded pistol goes off and Israel's dead. But that loaded pistol had to be loaded with the potential not to defend southern Lebanon, but to actually strike into Galilee and occupy Galilee. And Hezbollah had that capacity prior to October 7th. Hezbollah had long range strike capability. Hezbollah had the capability to insert thousands of highly trained fighters under the ground in tunnels to pop up in Israeli villages and towns and seize control of these towns so that the war that Israel would fight against Hezbollah would not be fought on southern Lebanese territory, but on northern Israeli territory. And this changes the entire dynamic for Israel in terms of that conflict. Hassan Nasrallah made a strategic decision because I personally believe, and I think the evidence shows, that he was not briefed beforehand by Hamas as to what they were doing on October 7th. Neither was Iran. And when they woke up on the morning of October 7th, Hassan Nasrallah and President Raisi of Iran went, "What just happened?" We weren't ready for this. We didn't. Not only weren't we ready for this, we didn't want this. This was not the strategic direction that either of the nations were going. Iran was gearing up for the BRICS and transitioning into, sort of a period of economic, revitalization, building a system that defeated the sanctions that were imposed on the West. And Hezbollah was there to provide support for that. But also Hezbollah was transitioning into the role of governing Lebanon. The last thing either one of these entities, Hezbollah or Iran, wanted was a war with Israel. But because they supported, and this is what should just underscore the betrayal of the Sunni Arab world towards Palestine, because Hezbollah and Iran supported the Palestinian cause, and they supported the right of Palestinians to have a homeland. When Hamas made a decision to fight to achieve this, both Hezbollah and Iran said, "Okay, we have to do something to help." But they weren't going to launch a major war against Israel. That was never in the cards. First of all, if Hezbollah and Iran engaged early on decisively with Israel, this would not be about Hamas, Gaza, and the Palestinian people. This would be about a greater axis of resistance struggle against Israel, and the world would not rally against Israel, but rather rally in support of Israel. In order for the Hamas plan to work, the attention always had to be on Gaza and Hamas. So how do you help? If you're Hassan Nasrallah, and he said this came out in his October 9th presentation, you begin a policy of managed escalation, a war of attrition designed to freeze Israeli resources in place and to begin a process of wearing down Israel politically, economically, militarily, without reaching that line that says this is now existential. So that no matter what was happening in northern Israel, southern Lebanon, the world was always focused on Gaza. And it worked. It worked brilliantly. Even Iran, when Iran intervened with True Promise 1 and True Promise 2, these weren't decisive knockout blows. They were simply demonstrations of capability to rebalance the deterrence equation between Iran and Israel. But the goal was never to take away from what was happening. Gaza always dominated. Every morning, the world woke up to the horrific reality of what Israel was doing to the Gazan civilians. Every single morning. You couldn't ignore it. It was there. But Hassan Nasrallah, in making this decision, sacrificed his offensive capability against Israel. You see, Hezbollah, if for Hezbollah's offensive potential to be realized, it would have to take place early on in any major fight between Hezbollah and Israel, and would have to incorporate the element of surprise, meaning that Hezbollah strikes decisively, boom, and Israel now is in reactive mode. This is sort of extension of John Boyd's um, OODA loop, getting in, the Orient, observe, orient, decide, act, the fighter pilot's mantra of how you always win an air-to-air engagement. But the concept applied to ground is to get inside the enemy's decision-making cycle, to make the enemy react to you. And if the enemy's always reacting to you, that means you're in control. And Hezbollah needed to have the Israelis reacting to Hezbollah. Hezbollah would be in control of the fight. They would manage that. But when Nasrallah made the decision to do the opposite, gradual war of attrition, gradually building up, he sacrificed that strategic capability. And in doing so, he also put Iran in a difficult position because Iran's ability to confront Israel was always contingent upon this loaded pistol of Hezbollah at the head of Israel. But to support the cause of Hamas, Hezbollah gave up that loaded pistol. Um, and that's where we are today. So even though Hezbollah isn't defeated, Hezbollah no longer is that loaded pistol against the head of Israel because Hezbollah today does not have the capacity to surge 8 to 10,000 highly trained troops into northern Israel and back them up with strategic firepower from ballistic missiles. But what Hezbollah can do is defend southern Lebanon and go into a long-term war of resistance to evict the Israelis from Lebanon. And they've done that in the past and they will do it again. So Hezbollah is not defeated. Hezbollah, just their strategic reality has changed because of decisions made by Hassan Nasrallah. And I'll leave it with this. We can't, you know, it's no exaggeration that the loss of Hassan Nasrallah is a huge problem for Hezbollah, politically and militarily. Yes, they have very effective military leaders, but to have this figure that was almost legendary, this man who had been in power since 1992, the man who had defeated Israel, drove them out of southern Lebanon and defeated them in a stand-up fight in 2006, who carried out this very effective war of attrition against Israel, a man who commanded the respect not only within Lebanon but around the world. To have him dead, one of the dangers that any nation has when they have a leader who has of such charismatic character be in power for so long is that they tend not to have a viable plan B when that leader goes away. And Hezbollah does not have a viable plan B. They don't have a Hassan Nasrallah out there who carries the same, gravitas when it comes to Lebanese politics, when it comes to international relations, and that is something that also weighs heavily on Hezbollah. But if you think that Hezbollah is defeated, hold my beer and wait until the 60 days of the ceasefire ends and see what happens.
I like the distinction you made between Hezbollah's capacity to evict Israel from southern Lebanon or even influence parts of northern Israel, as opposed to Hezbollah's ability to act within a larger axis of resistance, which is what is, if I understand you correctly, is probably weakened as you see. I want to ask you about Syria, but before that, if I can ask you about your experience of uh, your experience in the Arab world. What do you think the fall of Syria has changed in terms of the balance of power within the Arab world?
Ah, boy. The problem is to answer that question honestly, and I will. Um, it requires a very brutal assessment of the Arab world. And I don't want to come across as racist. I don't want to come across as Islamic phobic. Um, but let's just be straight up honest. The Arab world is a catastrophe. That doesn't mean that the Arab people are, um, you know, problematic. I believe that, we always talk of the Arab street, and how rulers have to pay attention to the Arab street, pay attention to the souk, the market, the will of the people. But for the most part, um, the Arab Spring that was supposed to sweep out all these old oligarchs and such, it didn't. You had something happened in Tunisia that has been, it has not manifested itself the way I think people wanted. Um, Egypt, yes, we saw the elimination of one, um, dictator replaced by another, um, and nowhere else. I mean, they were, the thought was that Bashar al-Assad would be swept aside, but it took another 14 years, 13, 14 years for that to happen, and it wasn't because of the Arab Street; it was because of CIA money. Um, so
And Libya
the
was a catastrophe,
Libya
split between
100% catastrophe. The elimination of Bashar al-Assad, I mean of
Gaddafi.
Muammar Gaddafi, um, and that serves as a model. But before that, we knew that about Iraq, the elimination of Saddam Hussein.
Hmm.
Um, and then take a look at what happened in Iraq. Iraq is still mortally wounded. It hasn't recovered from that. And I don't think we've seen the last of Iraq. I think you're going to see what happened in, the earthquake of the fall of Bashar al-Assad. I think will create geopolitical tremors that will um, crash in on Iraq in a potentially catastrophic manner. So, you know, and the reason for all of this is because the Arab leaders, the Arab world is so fundamentally weak.
Do you mean, sorry for interrupt, do you mean it might trigger the old civil war, the Sunni resistance or civil war against the Shia, that kind of thing?
I think we may be looking at a resurgence of ISIS
Hmm.
and Al Qaeda and Sunni Islamic extremism
Hmm.
that will be used by Turkey to restore the vilayet of Mosul and Kirkuk to Turkey proper, which they believe historically should have been the case at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, if it weren't for the British arbitrarily drawing lines on a map. Um, that's what I'm talking about. And for Iraq to lose those oil fields in the north and to lose that territory, it would be, it changes fundamentally what Iraq, is. Um, this is what I'm talking about. This isn't an Arab Spring. This is basically what we're going to be seeing, I think, in the Middle East, is all of the lines that were drawn on the map with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire are going to be erased, and you're going to see a free for all of violence in the region. That's the potential. I hope that's not the case, but
Hmm.
one of the reasons why I believe it will be the case is that Arab leadership is horrific, horrific, totally out of touch with the needs, wants, desires of the people, and as a result, the frustration that is felt amongst the people gets captured by Islamic extremist movements that have, and this is my belief. I don't pretend to be an expert on Islam at all. Um, I have spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I have spent a lot of time talking with um, Shia Sunni clerics. Um, I have studied Sufism, not to become a adherent, but just because as I read the history of the region, Sufism plays such an important role. I've delved into the theological differences between the Ismailis and Shia faith, the Alawites, and other Shia offshoots. For instance, that which the Houthi embrace. I've studied the main schools of thought of the Sunni faith. I've studied the roots of Wahhabism and Salafism. Um, you know, but I will admit to having passing or superficial knowledge. I am not a student of the Hadith. I cannot quote the Quran convincingly. Um, so I'm left to having to listen to people explain Islam to me and decide whether they're credible or not. And as a human being, I have decided to give more credence to those Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, who have said that Islam is a religion of peace, and that Islam is not a religion that seeks to conquer by the sword and to forcefully compel people to yield to their faith, etc. Um, that may be the case, but I will also say that Islam contains a component of violence that is either being isolated and perverted in the cause of Islamic extremism, or is the genuine true heart of Islam. I mean, I find it interesting that those elements that Salafism, Wahhabism, that go back to the traditional roots of Islam, to say this is the Islam of Muhammad, the Prophet, are violent. And it's those who seek peace actually are reinterpreting or reimagining Islam in the context of the modern world and modern reality. Um, so it's a tough struggle, and it's one that's come out with Syria. I am disgusted by people I thought were uh, again, this I don't mean to insult, but westernized Muslims. What I mean by that is Muslims that can live in America at peace, practice their religion as they see fit, but seek to integrate into American society in a non-threatening manner, because we're a nation that accepts all religions. We're a nation that accepts people's ability to have different beliefs. And so when I look at Muslims in America, I don't feel inherently threatened until I realize now that many of them harbor in their hearts this desire for Islamic extremism. And it came out when they cheer the collapse of Bashar al-Assad and and praise Jolani and Al Qaeda, ignoring the ISIS past or writing it off as this is the will of God, this is legitimate Sharia law being finally coming into fruition. I say, well, that is totally incompatible with me, the West, and others. If that's who you are, then we will be in an existential life and death struggle. Because what you're talking about being put in place inside Syria today is incompatible with international law as set forth by the United Nations Charter. That cannot be allowed to happen. And yet, when you look at the Islamic world, that appears to be that which is bubbling up inside various nations throughout the Middle East because of the inadequacy of their leadership, because the people feel abandoned by the secular leadership that they have. They turn to their faith, and their faith isn't state-controlled religion, but rather the religion of the Islamist extremists, the Wahhabists, the Salafists. And maybe that's the true face of Islam. Um, and so that's where I come from on the Syrian problem. Because to me, the way many people have reacted to the fall of Bashar al-Assad, look, they say he's horrible, he did this, he did that, he did this, he did that, and therefore he must be gone. Okay. But to replace him with Jolani and Al Qaeda, that's not okay. And to pretend that the Syrian resistance isn't that is a lie, because that is the Syrian resistance, because the Syrian resistance was created not by the legitimate needs, wants, and desires of the Syrian people, but rather that which is imposed on them by outside powers, by Turkey, by Qatar, by the United Arab Emirates, by Saudi Arabia, by the United States, Great Britain, and others who poured billions of dollars into creating an anti-Assad resistance, including in the United States, acknowledging straight up that Al Qaeda in this case is our ally, because Al Qaeda is enabling the diminishment of Assad. Um, that that cannot be supported. I won't support it. And I know I've disappointed a lot of people who have talked with me about the situation in Syria, but I'm a black and white kind of guy. Um, and if you're sympathetic or supportive of Salafism, Wahhabism, Al Qaeda, and ISIS, you're evil. And according to the tenets of Islam that were presented to me by, I would call, moderate Muslim clerics, they agree that that's evil, and you have to agree that that's a deviation from the path of peace that Islam is supposed to be on. And yet, many Muslims appear to speak with two faces on this issue, pretend to be a religion of peace up front, but secretly praise what happened and want this. Um, and that's problematic. And that's where I come. I know I probably just irritated 2 billion people, but you asked me a question, I gave you an answer. It's an honest answer that comes from, from an honest place.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to recognize that the Arab Spring was a kind of cocktail of uh, um, at least a few things. There was genuine anger, frustration against corruption and long dynastic rule that were not necessarily responsive to people. Then there was also the element of resistance against foreign invasion. This was true in Libya. This was true in Syria. This was true in Iraq. And then finally, there were divisions within communities, which was definitely more true in Iraq and less true perhaps in Libya and somewhere in the middle in Syria. And Patrick Coburn, for instance, says that it's essential to recognize all these elements. Otherwise, one arrives at the conclusion of excessive demonization of the old regimes in this naive hope that democracy would emerge from that. I wanted to ask you, though, as you were answering me, it seems to me that you have put less emphasis on groups of people, naive, maybe, you know, victims of propaganda, who might also be cheering the HTS because it is presented as an alternative to a dictator and also in wrongly as a moderate, diversity-friendly, nationalist Syrian element or entity. So I'm not sure if everyone that's supporting the fall of Assad is necessarily coming from the Sunni or Salafi Wahhabi jubilation of fall of a secular government. Your response?
Well, again, I at one time supported that thesis, but dig deeper into these people. I mean, the first thing comes out from these people who say, I'm not a Salafist, I'm not a Wahhabist. First thing they say is Hamas, 1982. And they start throwing out numbers, 20,000, 40,000, and the brutal slaughter of these innocent people by Hafez al-Assad. And I said, but what about the Muslim Brotherhood? And they, no, no, no. And that immediately discredits them in my book. If you don't understand what the Muslim Brotherhood was, what the Muslim Brotherhood was trying to do, and then you have to go back even further. When we speak of Syria, what are we talking about? What is Syria? It's a fake artificial state created by the French in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire, cobbled together, brought in, a Hashemite king, Faisal, who only ruled for like 20 days, or he was booted out. Um, but again, this mandate, French mandate, that put together a total artificiality where the French played off one power against the other and created all these divides. Then you have the Ba'athist revolution that said, okay, it's similar to what happened in Iraq. We understand we're a fake country, but we're a country. So let's make it a real country and create, Arab nationalism. And that was, the goal. I mean, Syria was part of the, United Arab Republic, together with Egypt and all this. And you saw from the very beginning. Again, I'm being superficial here because we don't have all the time in the world. History is a very complicated thing. I want to say this right off the bat. And as you said, you quoted Patrick Cogburn, once you start pulling threads, I mean, you find out that this thing you thought was a single thing is, entity is actually a carpet woven together by millions of threads that interact in different ways and such. So, but I will say this, that you had a number of movements competing inside this artificial entity called Syria. You had the Nasserites, supporters of Nasser, the Egyptian Arab nationalists. You had the Muslim Brotherhood, which was evicted from Egypt. People need to remember that in Syria and in conflict with Arab nationalism because it was about an Islamic state. And then you had sort of a socialist movement within Syria. And the socialist movement led to the Baathists taking over, evicting the Naserites, and having a fundamental existential issue with the Muslim Brotherhood. So this, if you're going to say you're a Syrian nationalist, I believe I'm a Syrian and all this, who are you? What are your roots? Are you a Nasserite? Are you a Muslim Brotherhood? Or are you a Baathist? Let's, so this notion that Assad comes from evil, a place of evil, is an absolute lie. 100% lie. The Muslim Brotherhood is a vicious, brutal Islamic extremist organization that seeks to slaughter anybody who doesn't agree with them. And in 1982, they launched an attack against the Syrian government. They slaughtered military officers in a military academy and their families. And the Syrian government came in and annihilated them. I'm not condoning the tactics used, but that's the truth. It's not that Hafez Assad woke up one morning and said, oh, what the hell, coffee, eggs, bacon, let's go slaughter people in Hamas. No, that's not what happened. The Muslim Brotherhood chose this fight. It was an existential fight designed to eliminate the Ba'athist regime, and the Baathists came in and eliminated the Muslim Brotherhood. So nothing happens in a vacuum. And if you forget that part of the history, then everything that goes forward after that is a lie. And the Muslim Brotherhood retreated into Turkey and elsewhere and played an important role in whatever came in 2011 after that. So we can't sit here. I don't believe anybody when they say, "Oh, I'm a peace-loving Syrian, and I was brutalized by the Assad regime." No, if you're a peace-loving Syrian, how do you identify yourself as a Syrian? If you identify yourself as a Syrian in accordance to the ideal of the Ba'athist Party, where you're trying to bring in these different people to work together as a singularity, then you have to support Bashar al-Assad. You have to support Bashar al-Assad. Assad didn't wake up in the morning and say, "I'm going to crush the Sunnis." He just said, "I don't want this. I don't want the Muslim Brotherhood here because it's evil from his perspective." The Muslim Brotherhood is looking at Assad saying, "You're evil." And then, the other thing, scratch a Sunni and you get somebody who hates the Alawites. It's just immediately I had so many people say, no, no, in my heart, I support, we don't support the subjugation of minorities. We don't support this, the Christians, the Jews. I said, well, what about the Alawites? They're not Muslim. They're not Muslim. They must be killed. They must be eradicated. Oh my God. So you're not a religion of peace. What about the Shia? The Shia are, they are deviants, apostates. Shiism must be eradicated. Oh, so Hafez al-Assad, as an Alawite, has every reason to treat you Muslim Brotherhood fanatics as an existential threat to his vision of Syria. And here's the last thing for the people that take the side of the Muslim Brotherhood or anybody who's not pro vision of his Syria as Assad laid out. How quickly they sell Syria out. As soon as I engage in a conversation about what the future of Syria will be, immediately the prospect of, well, Turkey will occupy us and there will be a period of Turkish occupation in which stability will be brought forth, similar to that which existed in the Ottoman Empire. I said, so you don't believe in Syria at all? You're not a Syrian. Stop calling yourself a Syrian. You're not a Syrian. You're an Islamist. You're an Islamist who's willing to sacrifice Syrian territorial integrity so that your vision of religion, of Sharia law, can be imposed on whatever we're going to call this thing. But it's not Syria. They are willing to allow Turkey to take Idlib, Aleppo, Raqqa, which Erdogan has said are rightfully part of Syria, are part of Turkey, should never have been turned over to the French mandate, and he's going to reverse this. So, no, I reject 100% at this point in time that it's possible to be a Syrian nationalist who was opposed to Bashar al-Assad. Because I just proved to you that they're not Syrians. They're Muslim fanatics, Islamists, who are willing to sell out Syrian national integrity, territorial integrity, in support of their Islamic cause. And they feel that the Turks will enable them to pursue their Islamic cause better than Bashar al-Assad's secularism. And
In
there,
the
I just alienated
No, no, thank you so much.
50,000 more.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I want to switch to Ukraine to understand your thoughts about somewhat unpredictable, emerging, new or old, whatever, US-Russia relationship. Some people are saying that there is a real possibility, a green shoot, if you like, in terms of breaking with years and years of US-Russia relationship, led by Trump, JD Vance, and I don't know, Rubio and others who are talking about peace, and then the deep state, which is perhaps resisting it, and we don't know what the outcome would be. Walk us through your thoughts at this moment as far as U.S.-Russia relationship, the future of U.S.-Russia relationship is concerned. Also, if you can just add a little bit about your experience in visiting Russia recently, that would allow us to humanize a little bit, humanize the conversation, which is otherwise so brutal.
Okay, well then what we're going to do is we're going to pull back for a second and talk about U.S. Russian relations. Um, I grew up in the Cold War, and that was my thing. And the Cold War was a bipolar world divided between the forces of good, democracy, America, and the forces of evil, communism, and the Soviet Union. And that's why Ronald Reagan, I'm telling this narrative from an American point of view. I know I've just got a lot of people out there that might question what I'm talking about, but it's important to know that I was raised in an environment where the Soviet Union was considered the evil empire, literally the evil empire. They were our existential enemy. My father deployed to Turkey twice. The first time was in the 1960s in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he deployed with an F-100 squadron that was stationed at Chile Air Base that had fighters on standby. That means the plane is on the strip with a nuclear bomb underneath, a pilot in the cockpit, um, ready to launch and bomb the Soviet Union because they are evil. We went again in the 19, and my dad also served in Vietnam, and to me that was an extension of the democracy versus communism struggle. My dad deployed to Korea in the aftermath of the Pueblo incident, that the American ship that was taken over by the North Koreans. His fighter squadron deployed to South Korea to reinforce because it looked like we might go to war. I grew up ready for war. I lived in Turkey in the 1970s, where literally across, I mean, everything that was happening in Turkey when I was in Turkey, the entire American community in Ankara was all one giant espionage ring against the Soviet Union. Um, and then we moved to Germany, and you see that Germany at that time was 100% an armed camp with hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and British soldiers and others, NATO prepared to repel a Soviet attack. That was our thing. They were going to attack us. So when I graduated from high school in 1979, I went straight into the military. Why? Because I wanted to defend my system from them. I volunteered to go on the front lines. I wanted to be the first guy there when they came across the border so I could kill a commie for mommy, because that's what it was all about. Later went on in the Marine Corps because it's a higher level of efficiency of killing Soviets, and spent a lot of time training. I went to college and I studied Russian history. I took Russian language. Why? You have to know your enemy. You have to know your enemy. But here's the distinction. Never once did I do anything other than respect my enemy, meaning that I didn't come up with an artificial understanding of who they were. I didn't manufacture anything. I wanted to know the truth, who these people are. I needed to know their culture. I needed to know their history. I needed to know their literature, their language, everything about them. And I worked hard to do it. And the system at the time encouraged this. At no time did the U.S. government ever tell me, um, you must interpret everything you hear about the Soviet Union as this. The mission given to me was learn about the Soviet Union, learn how it works, learn its realities. I had the opportunity in 1988 I joined what's called the On-Site Inspection Agency, Department of Defense activity created in the aftermath of the signing of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev that eliminated entire categories of nuclear armed missiles that threatened uh, European and global security. And we were going to get rid of these missiles. And I was tasked with implementing that along with others. I was assigned to Votkinsk machine building plant, a factory that produced SS-20 intermediate range missiles, but also SS-20 intercontinental ballistic missiles. And my job, along with others, is to build a multi-million dollar monitoring facility that would help us determine that the missiles coming out of the factory weren't the prohibited SS-20s, but the permitted SS-25s. Um, in order to do this in a closed area, a defense area that everything was secret, a defense town, we lived there permanently, 30 Americans permanently stationed outside this factory. We had to work with our Soviet counterparts to make this happen. And what happened there is that our learning about the Soviets went from being book studies, what you learn from books, academic, to being reality based. Um, these people were right there. Votkinsk is the birthplace of Tchaikovsky, Pyotr Tchaikovsky, great Russian composer. And they're very proud of that. Now, I've listened to grew up with the Nutcracker Suite, and you know, I was familiar with Swan Lake, and I was familiar with Tchaikovsky's work. But to be there in the town where he was born and see how how Tchaikovsky resonates with everybody, suddenly the connectivity between culture and humanity is real. You realize it's not propaganda, it's not an academic exercise, it's real, it's there. Um, and I realized at that point in time that while we might have a problem with their government, this was not an evil empire. It was a nation populated by people who wanted the same things I wanted, and et cetera. So that's a long way of saying that there is so much value to be had by going to a place and meeting the people and having an open mind about learning who they are and what they are. Um, and I carried that back with me, but I left, the last time I was in um, Russia was 1992. I hadn't returned since that time. And what happened in the 1990s is that the Cold War ended, and we went into this period of stagnation. That the role America played in the horror of the the decade of the 1990s, is unknown to most Americans. Recently, there was a memorandum that was declassified and released under the Freedom of Information Act that was written in 1994 by an American diplomat named Mary. Um, and they're likening it to sort of the second long telegram. The first long telegram was written by George Kennan, 1946, and paved the way for the creation of the policy of containment, which led to the Cold War. This one talked about what America was doing in Russia, and this perversion of democracy. When he wrote this in 1994, it comes after Boris Yeltsin, whom we supported. In October of 1993, he put tanks in the streets of Moscow and declared war against the Russian parliament, fired on the parliament, killed parliamentarians, stormed the parliament. And we then, instead of calling out Yeltsin for what he is, a brutal autocrat, we said, no, 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 he's a democratic guy. We're going to pretend that didn't happen, and we're going to do this election thing that's going to, empower democracy. But the problem is the people that were opposed to Yeltsin won the elections, and now Russia's in this period where we have to continue to support Yeltsin, which means we're not supporting democracy. And when he was coming up for re-election in 1996, instead of letting the forces of democracy do their thing and evict him and bring somebody new, we bought an election. We went in and corrupted it. We made Boris Yeltsin king. He couldn't be touched because we backed him up. And in doing so, we turned our back on, creating a legitimate democratic movement in Russia. The reason why there is no democratic movement in Russia today is because of the United States of America. We killed it. We slaughtered it. We butchered it. We never gave it a chance. And we did that for selfish political reasons, ignoring the economic realities that created the domestic political push back against Yeltsin. And Russia went through a horrific time. Millions of Russians died because of the economic catastrophe that was taking place. And we encourage this. Um, the
In the
people that I used
90s.
to work with, go ahead,
You were talking about the 90s, right? The
1990s.
hyperinflation. Yeah.
Yeah, not just hyperinflation. I'm talking about the mass murder of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of pensioners to steal their homes and sell them to the mafia. I'm talking about um, uh, a working class of educated Soviet era um, scientists committing suicide because there is no employment for them. I'm talking about drug addicts. I'm talking about children disappearing, hundreds of thousands disappearing into a wasteland of no laws where they are trafficked sexually, they're slaughtered for their organs. This was Russia. It was a horrible place. The Russian people lost faith in themselves and started to look to the West to salvation, which is what we wanted. We wanted to destroy the Russian spirit. In order to do that, we had to redefine Russia as a bad place. There's nothing proud to be had. Um, People like me who were the Russian experts in the 1980s were no longer welcome. I was interviewed by the CIA in 1993 um, to come in as a Soviet or Russian analyst. And I was rejected, even though I had two classified commendations from the director of the CIA for my work in the Soviet Union as a Soviet expert, Russian expert. They said, no, you're old. You're old thinking. We want new thinking. New thinking was, we don't want you to know Russia and love Russia. We want you to manipulate and exploit Russia. And that's what this was. And the reason why I bring this up is when Vladimir Putin came in and said, "No, I'm not going to allow this to happen," and stood up. Look, in short, look at where Russia was in 1999, and look where it is today. It is just a orders of magnitude better than it was. That's because of Vladimir Putin. We hate Putin not because he's undemocratic. We hate Putin because he rebuilt Russia and brought Russia back up. Russia's undemocratic because of us. Because even when Putin tried to bring democracy back in, we corrupted by the CIA funding Navalny, Nemtsov, and the others. We corrupted it, and we continue to corrupt it. But now what's happened in the United States is we have uh, this ignorance about Russia because we have people like Michael McFaul, who was an ambassador under Barack Obama, but he was in Russia in the 1990s, part of this system of corrupting Russia. He's not there as somebody who knows Russia, who loves Russia, who believes in Russia. He's there as somebody who hates Russia and wants to destroy Russia. And so he and others, all of these Russian experts today, none of them are Russian experts. There's not a single Russian expert in the advising U.S. government today, whether it be Trump or whether it be Biden. They are all people who have been infected with Russophobia. These are people who hate Russia, who fear Russia, and they promulgate this irrational fear of Russia premised on Vladimir Putin being this evil, brutal dictator who is the enemy of all things democratic, which is just an outright lie. Um, so now how do you defeat that? Well, I go back to my roots. How did I overcome the notion of the evil empire in the 1980s? I lived in Russia, Soviet Union. I saw them. I shopped in their stores. I ate in their restaurants. I walked in parks with their people. I skied with them. We got to know each other, and it changed my outlook. So I felt that it was imperative that I go back to Russia and re-engage Russia in this way because a lot had happened. I mean, I went back to Russia in May of 2023, and the last time that I was in Russia was in November of 1992. So we're talking, 21 years have passed. Oh God, my math is horrible. 31 years had passed. Uh, Russia had changed, and I couldn't say that. I could say that I had book knowledge of Russia, but I couldn't say that I knew who the Russian people were or what Russia was. I went there and I spent almost the entire month of May traveling Russia. I had my book about arms control published in Russian language, and I went around talking about the book, engaging with Russian audiences, but also seeing Russia, learning from the Russians, listening to the Russians. And I came back and I started to use this as a mechanism of inoculating the American public against Russophobia to say this is the reality of Russia. It's not what you're being told. It's something totally different. I went back in December of 2023, January of 2024 to do the same thing. And I was supposed to go back in June for a 40-day visit that would take me from Kamchatka to Kaliningrad and everywhere in between to this. The U.S. government finally woke up to what I was doing and how effective I was being. So they pulled my passport to prevent me from going because, my God, we can't have the American people actually educated about the reality of Russia. No, 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 no. We must keep this Russophobia going. And unfortunately, the Trump administration is being advised by people who continue to be influenced by this old thinking. Even people who want to be friends with Russia or want not to be at conflict with Russia, J.D. Vance and others, they're ignorant about Russia because they don't understand what Russia is, who the Russian people are, who Vladimir Putin is, how he came into being. Um, and as a result, it colors their analysis that leads to the formulation and implementation of policy. When you have Keith Kellogg believe that Donald Trump can come in and tell the Russians that they have to accept a freezing of the conflict, and and they have to make certain concessions to the Ukrainians, and that includes a 20-year window for NATO to come in. That means you don't know anything about Russia. You don't know anything about their history. You don't know anything, and that's why no sooner did they put this on the table, the Russians swept it away and said no. Now, with Russophobia in place, you can take the rejection of the by the Russians as an indicator that Russia has no desire to live in peace with the West. That's just an absolute lie. Russia wants nothing more than to live in peace with the West, but it has to be peace that recognizes that Russia has legitimate spheres of interest and that Russia has a legitimate national security interests that are as important to the Russians as ours are to the United States, as Europe is to European security is to Europeans. Um, and so I think we have a window of opportunity where we have people who want to end this conflict with Russia and to move past it, but they don't have the tool set because the tool set that they're using is a tool set that's influenced by Russophobia. And it's imperative that they get a tool set that is geared towards the reality of Russia. Not that we're surrendering. You don't surrender when you embrace reality. You're doing the right thing. But see, there's too many people because we have built policy so long with this toolbox of ignorance that any deviation from that, we say, well, you're surrendering to the Russians. No, we're admitting that this toolbox is fundamentally flawed, that this isn't a toolbox based upon reality. No matter how much Americans believe in the supremacy of America, we don't get to make our own history. We don't get to make our own facts. We have to deal with the world as it is, not as we want it to be or as we think it should have been. Um, and that's the problem, is that the Trump administration today is not grounded in the reality of Russia. And I'm hopeful that I will get my passport back and maybe sometime in the spring and the summer get back to Russia so that I can help inoculate the Trump administration. I know that they're open to this thinking because I have some connectivity with people on the periphery of Team Trump who have talked to me about Russia policy and all that, and they have influenced J.D. Vance and others. So I know that there's a willingness to at least be open to learning more about Russia in Team Trump than there ever was in the Biden administration. The Biden administration was 100% Russophobic, and you were never going to make any progress in terms of improving U.S.-Russian relations as long as the Democrats were in power.
What could be some of the terms of disengagement as far as this conflict is concerned? We are told about the classic Minsk II, some kind of autonomy to parts of Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine, and Ukraine being able to join EU if they like, but not NATO, and yeah, kind of a neutrality, if you like. What do you think could be some of those terms of disengagement?
I think we first of all have to start off with the following premise that any term that's being conceived in the West should not be considered at all. Ukraine has lost this war, and NATO, because it chose to engage Russia using Ukraine as a proxy, has lost this war. In the United States, because we chose to side with NATO in pursuit of this, we have lost this war. Russia has won this war. So if your starting point is, I wonder what Brussels is thinking about the cessation of conflict. No one cares. Brussels doesn't matter. I wonder what they're thinking in Washington, D.C. think tanks about how this conflict should end. No one cares. The only school of thought should be, I wonder what they're thinking in Moscow. Because Moscow, the thought coming out of Moscow, is the only thought that matters. And so if you're seeking to get some sort of compromise, it has to be by taking the Russian position, understanding why the Russians believe the pillars of this position are important, and then working to convince the Russians that in the best interest of a deal that everybody can buy into, that Russia needs to yield on these following pillars without compromising their strategic objective. A frozen conflict, Russia will never support. European peacekeepers in Ukraine, Russia will never support. Russia will never support NATO in Ukraine. And if you want to jump in and say the European Union, not so long as the European Union and the United States talk about a conflict designed to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. See, then the European Union is a threat. So the very first thing that has to happen is that the United States has to approach the Russians and say, we no longer support a policy seeking the strategic defeat of Russia, nor do we support a European policy to that extent. We have a policy that seeks the peaceful coexistence with Russia on terms that recognize Russia's legitimate spheres of influence and interest. Boom. If you start with that, the Russians will sit down at the table and start talking to you. But then you have to understand that you lost this war. So Russia sort of gets to determine what the future of Ukraine is going to be. Russia gets to do that. Only Russia gets to do that. And if you don't understand that, then you haven't paid too much attention. The West will have zero say in what Ukraine looks like. Russia will have the say, and the best way to get Russia to do something that is supportive to the West is to sit down with the Russians and say, hey, what are you thinking about Ukraine? That's how you have to start the conversation. What are you thinking about the future of Ukraine? What are your opinions? Oh, wow, okay, that's pretty cool. Gosh, if you do that, you might run afoul over here. Could we talk about maybe doing something different? And the Russians say, okay, what do you propose? You see the difference in the approach, as opposed to Russia, this is the way Ukraine's going to be. Russia's going to say, you didn't win the war. We won the war. You don't get to dictate any terms to us at all. None. That's the reality. And it continues to amaze me that there's people in the West that believe that Europe gets a vote. Europe gets no vote. There's people that believe the United States gets a vote. You don't get a vote if you're American. You were on the wrong side. You put all your chips in on a bad hand of cards and you lost.
I don't want to drain you by asking this boring question, but since the Western press is still propagating this idea that Ukraine can still go on fighting, can you dispel this myth? Can you just tell us a little bit about why you said Ukraine has lost this war?
Well, Ukraine lost the war because Ukraine lost the war. I mean, it's just military math. There's not a single statistic or point area of the conflict where Ukraine is prevailing. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have my dogs sing as somebody approaches the door. I think the mailman's here, but hopefully they'll stop in a second. But he's not leaving. But I'll do my best to continue. But I don't know. Can you hear the dogs?
No, I don't.
Okay, if you can't hear the dogs, then we're not going to
Yeah.
work. Okay, the mailman's gone, so we're good. Um, the the Ukrainians aren't winning economically. Ukraine is an economic basket case. So anybody who says the Ukrainians can go on, demonstrate how they can do that economically, and you can't. Europe is exhausted. They don't have any more money. The United States is unwilling to continue to fund. That's done. Ukraine has had its army destroyed and rebuilt 4 times. And it's being destroyed as we speak, and there's nothing left to rebuild it. The arsenal of democracy doesn't exist. There's nothing left to give Ukraine. And even if we had something to give the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian manpower pool has been severely depleted, to the point where now where they're left with lowering the conscription age to 18 and bonking people on the head and taking them to the front line without adequate training. Um, so that's the reality of it. Ukraine will lose, is losing, has lost. That doesn't mean that Ukraine can't fight. And I think sometimes people conflate the two. The Russians, and I've been amazed by this too. But I've spoken with Russian commanders and Russian journalists about the ability of the Ukrainians to resist. And they said, well, we always knew that they were going to be tough fighters. They're, because they're us. I mean, they told a story about Wagner in Bakhmut. In the latter stages of the fight, as Wagner, the Russian mercenary organization, was closing in and it occupied the town. They had surrounded an element of Ukrainian forces in a basement of a building, and there was no chance. They surrender or die. So the Russians called down. The Wagner guy said, "Hey, brothers, surrender. You fought bravely. We won't kill you. We're going to give you, tea. We'll take you prisoner. You'll be able to go home to your families. You fought honorably." And you know what the Ukrainians shouted back? Russians don't surrender. Now, why would they say that if they're Ukrainian? Because they're not Ukrainian. Russians don't surrender is a statement, a phrase that comes from the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, that common heritage of Ukraine and the Russian people, where a Russian soldier surrounded by Germans was given the option to surrender. He said, Russians don't surrender. He wasn't even a Russian, the guy who said it, but he said it, and it became the rallying cry. Russians don't surrender. So the Russians always said, they're us. We're fighting ourselves. This is like more like a civil war than anything else. But even then, the Russians said, we don't understand the willingness to fight to the death. That when a situation would come where you could either expect them to retreat or surrender, they instead choose 9 times out of 10 to fight to the death. And therefore, we have to go in and dig them out. And it's a very difficult fight. We win, but it's costly. It takes time. And it's continuing to happen even at this late stage in the fight. You'll see the fresh recruits who come in without adequate training, with bad command and control, they're surrendering. I guess the 155th Brigade went into fighting in the Pokrovsk region, 5 to 7,000 guys, and immediately 1,500 of these poorly trained people just quit. That's the reality. But the others, they're going to fight. And to give you an example of how difficult this is, there's a video that's going around the internet that shows a Ukrainian officer fighting a Yakut, a Russian of Yakut. It's a brutal fight, a brutal hand-to-hand combat, and in the end, the Russian wins by stabbing the Ukrainian to death. But when the fight ends, the words that are exchanged between the two men are of brothers. You fought honorably. You were a good fighter. You did. I mean, that's the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in a nutshell. The Russians are going to have to kill every single one of these people in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and at the end, they don't hate each other. They respect each other as fighters. But Russian will win. They will walk away from the battlefield with the Ukrainian dead. That is the reality of what's happening here. It's a horrible situation, very bloody, very brutal. There's nothing easy about it. But Russia cannot lose because Russia has the correlation of forces that give it the supremacy on the battlefield. And no matter how brave the Ukrainians are, you can't overcome that reality.
I want to quickly ask you about Europe in this equation. I mean, there is one way to say that even Europe doesn't matter at all. The other way is to think that European Russophobia is a significant impediment between normalization of relationship between Russia and the West, collective West, where the US plays a larger role. And if you follow the liberal press, the FTs and the Guardians and the Economist, you get a sense that the European elite is unrelenting about the narrative that Russia is the greater evil. But there are alternatives um, at the level of the people, and sometimes political alternative from even people who might be right wing and far right, whose politics might not be great domestically. What's your reading about Europe's attitude to relationship between the West and Russia?
Well, I think first of all we have to understand that what we call Europe is has undergone a radical change over the course of the past several decades. When I used to live in Europe, I lived in West Germany. I traveled extensively through Europe. And when I mean Europe, I mean Europe. When I crossed the German border into France, I entered a different country. There was border control checkpoint. I got a stamp in my passport. I had to exchange my German Deutschmarks into French francs. And then if I crossed into Spain, I had to do the same thing. Go through a border control point, stamp in the passport, buy pesos. That was Europe. Europe was a continent comprised of a number of sovereign states. But then in the 90s, they decided that they were going to create something called the European Union that would redefine what Europe is. So today you have a singular currency. Um, the ability of governments to act independently has been diminished by the creation of this Council of Europe and the European presidency and all this kind of stuff. None of which works, by the way. I mean, Europe went from being a continent where if the French president spoke, people listened. The German chancellor spoke, people listened. To a place where you know it's just the Tower of Babel, and it makes nothing happens. And the the thing about the Russophobia is that Russophobia, to the extent that it exists in Europe, is a reflection of American Russophobia that has been reflected onto the political and economic elite because this European Union is actually, I believe, a part and parcel of American strategic objective to weaken Europe, not strengthen Europe, to keep Europe perpetually subordinated to the United States economically, politically, and militarily. Um, as we created the European Union, NATO still lords over them. What's more important when it comes to defining European goals and objectives? A statement made by the Secretary General of NATO or a statement made by Ursula von der Leyen? And we know which one carries, but even NATO now carries no weight because it's been so diminished by the United States. NATO can't speak without America backing it up. So there is no Europe today. It's a fake entity that is going to collapse because it has no viability. And one of the reasons it's collapsing is that it has irresponsibly joined in on this Russophobic driven policy towards Ukraine. Uh, you know, I'm not an economist. I yield to Jeffrey Sachs on this and others, um, but I am a historian and I am an analyst of the region. And I will tell you that in December of 2021, I wrote a very detailed article that basically said that if Europe joins in with the United States to sanction Russia, to try to have a war of sanctions, that it will backfire on Europe and Europe will kill itself economically because the key is cheap gas, cheap energy, and there is no alternative to cheap energy when you're talking about economic survival. And as the economies collapse, so will the political power of these elites. They will collapse. Society will redefine itself from being this massive neutered sheep being led by these, I don't want to be too insulting, but whatever one want to call European leadership. Um, and you'll see nationalism reemerge, where it's important to be a German, where it's important to be a Frenchman, because under Europe, the concept of what it meant to be German, French, all that disappeared. You were European. But then Europe opened the borders to brought in non-Europeans to flood in the immigrants. You start blending East Europeans with West Europeans, and suddenly nations that had felt comfortable with who they are, like Germany, are suddenly very uncomfortable about what they've become. And so you have all of this tension taking place, a collapsed economy, et cetera. Look what's happening. Um, we can call Alternative for Deutschland right wing and all that. I don't. I call them a reflection of German politics and German reality. They are rejecting, Newton's third law of physics applies not only to physics, but to geopolitics as well. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And when you have, the Green Party together with other left-leaning parties embark on policies which have failed, the reaction coming back will be called right wing, but it's not. It's just a reaction to the failure of this element, which was green, woke, left, whatever you want to say. This is what we're seeing. We're seeing the political and economic elites being swept from power because of their own stupidity, because of their own failed performance. And they're going to be replaced with entities that aren't seeking to further or continue the failed European experiment, but rather to reestablish the national identity of their respective piece of turf. That's what's happening in Germany. Alternative for Deutschland has said if they win the election next year, and it looks like they might, they're going to walk away from the European Union. Why? Because the European Union is bad for them. Look at Romania. They had a presidential election where, again, they call it far right. It's not far right. It's a reaction of the people against the failure of the political entities that have been governing them imperfectly. You had the court step in at the behest of the West to nullify this election, even though there's no legitimate reason to do that. That's sort of the last desperate gasp of defending the old elites. The old elites will crumble. They're collapsing right now. They will not survive this. You're going to see a total radical transformation of Europe away from the singularity of the European Union into a massive nation seeking to reassert themselves as singular national identities. And it will weaken not just Europe as the idea of having Europe as this monolithic entity that could be used by the United States to maneuver against Russia now is going to be dividing the nations that Russia will be able to come in and use the divide principle, and that's the reality. And with it will go NATO. I think that NATO is also an institution that has long outlived its utility. Today, it's a corrupt entity, cannot be afforded by Europe. In order to have NATO work the way NATO wants it to work, you need a European Union willing to fund it. But as Europe breaks apart into individual nation states, none of which can sustain the level of military spending necessary to sustain NATO, NATO too will collapse. And behind it all is the United States, who is not willing to underwrite politically or economically the continuance of this NATO European Union disaster. And so that's where I think we stand on Europe. We're looking at the collapse of Europe, which, when we come back to Russia, is of fundamental importance, because understand this. In December of 2021, Russia put 2 draft treaties on the table on how to resolve the standoff between it and the collective West. One was given to NATO, the other was given to the United States. But that draft treaty was premised on a European singularity with a NATO cap on top of it, backed by the United States. Today, that doesn't exist anymore, and Russia's in a much stronger negotiating position to impose its will on the West. So I think the collapse of Europe is strengthening Russia's hand.
I want to ask you about your comment that NATO might be collapsing, and um, did Trump and others are trying to blackmail Europe and its other allies, Japan, to spend more on military. And a lot of people say that he might will be successful because for continental Europe, Germany and others who share surplus with the US, they fear huge tariffs, which Trump is already talking about. Britain, who has a sort of slight deficit, but it is anyway under the orbit of the US, and Japan might not be able to resist. And there are already talks about increasing Japanese military budget, and all this idea about Chinese threat and all are whipped up. So my question is, isn't there a possibility, isn't there a fear that NATO ends up getting more strengthened through expansion of military budgets in the European countries, Japanese countries? I know they are economically stressed, but who knows? Maybe a bigger austerity is imposed on their working class to divert. I mean, there are already talks about. I don't know if you have read about infrastructure fund that they were uh, planning in Europe, fund to be now diverted to military. So, yeah, your response on that.
Well, let's just go with what you just said. So Europe is building an infrastructure fund. Why? Because European infrastructure needs to be funded. Why? Because Europe is collapsing, eroding, falling down. So you're the average European citizen, German, French, whatever, and you wake up and you say, our life sucks. Our economy is horrible. Our politicians have spent all this money in Ukraine in this failed thing. We need to we need to be focused on things at home. And suddenly that failed leadership that you've already started to reject turns around and says, "Oh no, we're going to take all the money that we put aside for development, plus we're going to take your pensions and we're going to take your social welfare." You think the citizens are going to go, "Oh yeah, I didn't think about that." Sure, good. Why do you think the AfD is going to win this election? Because they reject that out of hand. This is unsustainable. It won't work in Germany. It won't work in France. It won't work anywhere. Nations can't, but the only two that matter are Germany and France. England is no longer part of the European Union, but they're collapsing as well. The British military is a joke today. It's not even worth calling it a military. The Boy Scouts of America have more, physical. I'm being exaggerating and being facetious here, but you know, you can take the entire British Army, put it in a big league soccer stadium, and have 30,000 unsold seats. That's not an army. It's not even a police force. There's more cops in New York City than there are British soldiers. So, that's the absurdity of this. And how are you going to do that when the British economy is collapsing? How are you suddenly going to say, "Oh no, we're going to turn around that fund in a meaningful way to fix this"? You should understand the rot of NATO military, the rot, and it is rotten to the core. The rot is so much that we're not talking about a new paint job. It's not like we're coming in saying, "Hey, plug the hole in the roof, new paint job, fix that joist, repair the door handle, and we now have a viable building." The foundation is gone. It is gone. In order to rebuild NATO, you have to tear everything down and start from scratch, and you can't afford that. There is no money for that. Germany, early on in this conflict, the Germans set aside 100 billion euro for the invigoration of the German military to bring it up to speed. Last year, in the German defense budget discussions, they said, "Well, we used all that 100 billion." Well, what did you get? Nothing. We spent $100 billion and we didn't get anything. Because why? Because it's so rotten that money just disappears. It's like a money pit. And so the German defense minister turns to the parliament and says, "Well, I need you to give me expenditures." I forget what he was looking for, 7, 8% growth in the budget, so that we can continue some of these programs that we started with this $100 billion. It's now gone. And the parliament went, "We can't do that. We don't have any money. So we're going to give you," and I forget what it was, a 1 point something percent increase, which is below inflation. Now, I'm not an economist, but I'm smart enough to know that um, if you have inflation, that's the purchasing power of your economy. And if you're below inflation, that means that your purchasing power is diminished. So if you budgeted based upon an X amount of dollars, but because of inflation, that's only worth this, and you don't increase the amount of money, you have less money to spend. And that's the reality. The Germans, at a time when they should be expanding their army or fixing their military, have to start cutting back. They're fixing nothing. They're cutting back. That's the reality. And now you're going to sit here and tell me that Germany's somehow going to magically transform and turn this thing around and become the powerhouse of Europe, building this new grand military you can take on the Russians. Well, what about Alternative for Deutschland? Don't you think they have a say? And why do you think Alternative for Deutschland has a say? Because the German people have rejected this and they're going to reject this. The same thing in France. Europe cannot build, cannot fund a military. They need the United States to step in, and America isn't going to do it. So now we come back to my original premise. It's over for NATO. NATO can't afford to exist. It's a nice club, but as you know, I used to play golf at a great little country club down the road. I love golf and all that, but economic realities came in. Kids had to go to college. And one day I woke up and I said, I can't be a member of this country club anymore. I had to quit. Well, that's Europe waking up saying, well, I can't be a member of this NATO country club anymore. Can't afford it. Got to quit. And that's what's going to happen to NATO. It just can't. Nobody can afford it.
Scott, this is my last question, and I want to preserve a little bit of personal memories as a archive of people we admire. We are building it in our small ways. My question is, what talk about a little bit about what inspires you when you do your anti-militarism activism, let's say. When you talk about building bridges, is it like pure consequentialist instinct that, oh, that's what protects American interests because or else we are going to a catastrophe? Or is it a broader humanitarian concern, a broader internationalist concern? What are some of the philosophies that have inspired you, both in terms of international relations, but also thinking about decent society, perhaps a little bit about your economic vision? You don't have to be an economist for that, but I have heard about you talking that we should give more education to people, healthcare, and so on. So yeah, just the final thoughts about who you are in terms of your philosophies.
Well, it's interesting. I'm a product of my upbringing. I'm a product of my childhood, of my adult um, experiences, which started during the Cold War and have extended to where we are today. Um, but the see, I can't accept the concept that I'm anti-military. I came from a military family.
I said militarism.
Yeah, militarism, but what is militarism? See, I have a Marine Corps background, and I love the Marine Corps, and I will never go against the Marine Corps. I believe America has a need to have Marines, um, because I believe that and I often quote this, and I get in trouble, but again, I don't care. Um, To Kill a Mockingbird is a great American novel and a great American movie. In the movie, um, Atticus Finch, this lawyer, was played by Gregory Peck. And there's a scene where, he's defending people and his kids view him as weak because he doesn't stand up and believe in violence and such. But there's a scene where there's a rabid dog loose in the town and the sheriff comes in and finds him and gives him the rifle. And Atticus Finch takes his glasses up, sights in, and pow, kills the dog. And the kid is like, why my dad? He said, your dad was the finest marksman in World War One. He's the guy that we had to go to. The point is, when there's rabid dogs in the street, you need the finest marksmen in the world. And you don't create them overnight. We need a Marine Corps. We have to have a Marine Corps. We have to have a military capable of killing the rabid dogs in the world, or else our society will always be under attack by threats that shouldn't be allowed to manifest themselves. So I don't reject the military, and I know this irritates a lot of people. But what I say is that before we use the military, we have to exhaust every venue possible short of war to resolve the issue. That the military must be the absolute last thing we turn to. My idea of the perfect Marine Corps career would be to join the Marine Corps and spend 20 years training so that when you retire, you are the best trained Marine in the world who has never seen combat, because our political leaders are so wise as to choose alternatives to war to resolve the issues. And I will say this too, there are rabid dogs in the world. But we can diminish rabies through inoculations and through health and taking care of the fundamentals. Rabies thrives in an area where disease is fostered. So why not focus on education? Why not focus on healthcare? Why not make those your priorities? When we speak of national defense, to me, national defense isn't just the Marine Corps. Actually, the Marine Corps, in order to have something to defend, you have to have something worthy of defending. So before we put money into the Marine Corps, we have to build something that's worthy of defending. We have to build a society where education is paramount. We have to build a society where healthcare is paramount. We have to build a society where people can, grow up healthily, get educated, and have jobs, meaningful jobs, jobs that contribute to the betterment of society. And then once you build that, you can build the Marine Corps over here to defend it. But if you start and say, I'm going to build a Marine Corps, and then all the other things, healthcare is bad, what are you defending? You end up defending the Marine Corps. You end up defending the system that creates the Marine Corps. The military industrial complex becomes the center. And this is where we have lost our way. We become so focused on building the perfect Marine that in order to do that, we have to have a system now that funds this. But in order to keep that funding going, we have to justify that funding. So we have to keep using the Marines. So we have to keep sending them overseas to fight in wars that don't need to be fought, that shouldn't be fought. Just because you have a Marine Corps doesn't mean you need to use the Marine Corps. No, you have the Marine Corps in case everything else goes wrong. But if you start with the fundamental premise of let's take care of ourselves, make ourselves healthy, and in doing so, transfer that approach to the rest of the world. Why do I have to invade you? Why can't, instead of spending $1 trillion, imagine if we had gone to Afghanistan, instead of spending $1 trillion to destroy that society, we turned around and invested properly. No strings attached, just start from grassroots, make people healthy, encourage education. You'll see a society will start to transform from within. And that 20-year experiment could have succeeded, perhaps, in creating a new Afghanistan. Instead, all we did is kick out the Taliban, spend 20 years destroying that society, and then the Taliban comes back, nothing changed except everybody's dead, everybody's poor. That's not smart policy. And I'm against that. I'm against what we did in Iraq. I'm against what we're doing with Russia. Not because I'm anti-military. There's rabid dogs out there. We need to kill the rabid dog. But we don't need to shoot the healthy dogs, and we don't need to shoot the owners of the healthy dogs, and we don't need to blow up their houses. And that's what we've become. The United States has become this nation. We are singularly focused on conflict because the only way our system can continue itself, sustain itself, is by creating new conflict. This is why I'm hopeful of Donald Trump. Do I think Donald Trump's perfect? Nope. I disagree with so much about him, but he at least is seeking to break the paradigm, to redefine how America operates with the world. He does it through a perversion of economy where it's American economic dominance as opposed to military dominance, but at least people aren't dying. And that's a good thing. I've traveled around the world, and you say, what motivates me? You know, in 1975, we had a Vietnamese family, South Vietnamese family, Pho Saigon. They were boat people who fled South Vietnam, and they're coming to the United States. And my family got on the list of people we would, bring in a family and take care of them until they could be relocated to their permanent home. So we had this South Vietnamese refugee family live with us, and it was. I had never been outside the United States until that point, and to have these people come in and then to talk with them and learn about them, you realize that there's just a whole world. There's kids my age and talking about their experiences growing up through war and what it was like to flee your home. You're like, holy cow, that's that's real. And yet here in the United States, I got up on my bike every day and rode down to the beach and surfed and fished and did whatever kids do in a paradise called Hawaii. Then we moved to Turkey, and I we didn't live on base. We lived in the economy, and I learned how to speak Turkish, and I interfaced. I mean, one of the great friends I had was Nazim, the flower man, who had a flower shop outside the American hotel where American families came before they found a place to live in town. And I became friends with him. And so I'd go down there and we'd drink tea and I'd help him with his flowers and we talk. It turns out that he was actually part of a Islamist political movement that was being suppressed by the Turks. But he would, talk to me, and I'd learn about it. I studied the history of Turkey, and so when I left Turkey, I didn't view Turkey as, as something fake. I knew Turkey for what it was. I went to Germany and did the same thing. Everywhere I've traveled, I've tried to go in and meet with the people and talk with the people and have sympathy. Why? Because I don't view humans as rabid dogs. I view humans as the building block of humanity, and that the best way to avoid war is to be able to communicate with one another and understand where people are coming from, so that when we sit down across the table, I don't hate you right off the bat. I sit down and say, hey, how you doing? I treat you as a human with respect, and you treat me the same way. Then I say, what concerns you? And you tell me. I say, wow, man, but if you do that, that bothers me over here. They said, well, what can we do? And next thing you know, you're working through this problem, and you solve the problem. There's not a problem out there that can't be solved if we approach it from humanity, from a place of humanity. The other thing is, killing humans is the worst thing in the world. Humans. I'm not talking about rabid dogs. I'm talking about humans. I'm talking about killing a fellow human being. It is the antithesis of what it means to be a human. And so we need to spend more time focusing on how to save lives, how to promote lives, how to, and you start with the children. You start with making sure the children have a family they can be nourished in, a home they can feel safe in, a society that supports them, etc. And if you start with each of that, then we don't have a genocide in Gaza, and we don't have what's happening in the Sudan. We don't have child slave labor in the Congo. We don't have child sex trafficking in Ukraine. Start with the children. Treat the children as humans, and you force yourself to be a human as well. And then as they grow up, that's how they'll approach. But if the children, they look to the adults and they see how we act, and then they start behaving in that manner, and hate perpetuates hate. We have to break the paradigm. And that's where I come from, is trying to break the paradigm. And I do that by working through the lies and distortions and the myths and the fabrications of history and who people are. And that's why what I'm trying to do in Russia is so important, because it's about bringing the reality of Russia to the American people, to introduce the Russians as people, fellow humans that we don't need to go to war with. And if we do that with everybody else, I think the world will be a better place. So that's where I come from. Not wanting to kill people, recognizing that you have to. And I don't believe the Marine Corps should ever be a reflection of society. It's not. The Marine Corps is a standalone entity. It should never reflect society. You don't want America to be like the Marine Corps, not at all. You want America to be the exact opposite. The Marine Corps is a unique standalone thing that exists. You have to treat it with a lot of respect and a lot of care. I came from that. It's impossible for me to leave that. Impossible. Sometimes I wish I hadn't, because the Marine Corps complicates my thinking, um, because I am singularly focused on closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower and maneuver.
Mm-hmm.
But I also have learned to recognize that that is not the solution that society should be seeking, that there are other solutions to these problems, and that it's important that we have leadership that seeks these other solutions and views the Marine Corps as literally the tool of last resort. The sheriff has come up to Atticus Finch. The rabid dog is threatening the town. Shoot the dog. That's what the Marine Corps is good for. Other than that, don't ever bring that rifle out again.
On that powerful note of invocation of To Kill a Mockingbird, Scott Ritter, thank you so much. It took us a little while to get in touch with you, but this was as good as it could be.
Well, thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content, so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.